Well, I said that even before Seymour Hersh described in detail how it happened. And I think Hersh's account is right now basically unchallenged and is essentially correct in my view. We know that to blow up this pipeline required a state actor. In other words, this was a massive, massive logistical challenge. Those are big pipes. They're encased in concrete. They're 240 feet below the water surface. There are strong currents. This is a massive operation. So some government or governments did it. And then the question is, which ones? And the intelligence agencies have been quite clear, actually, that Russia did not do this. Russia did not destroy its own infrastructure. That leaves just a few possibilities. And what makes me think that the United States did it, and I would say even before Hersh's account, is simply the fact that the United States said it was going to do it. President Biden said, with Chancellor Scholz standing next to him on February 7th, 2021, that 2022, let me make sure I get this right, that if Russia invades, that is the end of Nord Stream. And the reporter said, but Mr. President, this is the infrastructure of Russia and Germany. He said, believe me, we have our ways. And as soon as the explosion happened, the former foreign minister of Poland, who's in the know, he's a very well-connected person, tweeted, "Thank you, USA." And then our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, said, "We view this as a tremendous opportunity to wean Europe from Russian energy dependency." Then Victoria Nuland, our Undersecretary of State, said in the U.S. Congress, "We are delighted that Nord Stream is a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." Well, you really don't get much more than this. They're delighted at an act of international terrorism. They said Nord Stream would end if Russia invaded. Seymour Hersh's account describes technically how this was accomplished. And frankly, Europe just doesn't want to look at this. It's, oh my God, it's our ally. What are we going to do? So the German government won't report to the Bundestag. The Swedes won't report to the Germans. It's an unbelievable confusion, except for the fact that if you're an American, 68 years old as I am, you've lived through lots of covert operations. This is normal for the United States. This is not exceptional. That's maybe what's hard for people in Germany or people in Sweden or people in other places to get their head around. If you're an American, well, this is what Americans do. This is what covert operations are. We've been doing this for decades. And so I think it's, someone could come along with another story, but frankly, I'd be very
Well, there is another story. There is another story, and of course that popped up a few weeks ago. But to color this, I've lived in the U.S. for 10 years, and I became a naturalized citizen in the early 2000s. So I have dual citizenship, and I pay dear taxes for it. So I know this. But in Germany, people have basically this idealistic view of foreign policy, and they basically don't see covert operations, and basically they follow the U.S. mainstream media view quite clearly and quite straightforwardly, and there's lots of, or very little, contradiction. And so we do have another explanation right now. Then shortly after Chancellor Scholz went to the U.S., there was a story in all of the German mainstream media that was a sailing yacht with about 5 people on it that blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, and this ran on mainstream media. What do you say to this?
It worries me that the U.S. government can't come up with a better cover story than this ridiculous one. Even the Swedish government has laughed and said that this is an action by a state, not by 6 people on a boat. This is ridiculous, frankly, and it would be interesting to know what President Biden and Chancellor Scholz discussed privately when they didn't have a single aide around. Didn't do a press conference. And then this story appeared the next day. Again, frankly, this is so typical, except I would say that the cover stories are getting more and more ludicrous. Nobody believes this story. It was, of course, repeated in a few mainstream places, but that's a game. That's not a real story. You know, it's important for people to understand. Let me give you another point. A top journalist of one of our top newspapers that basically pointed that the Russians did it at the beginning said to me privately, when I met him just afterwards, I said, you know, I think the U.S. did this. He said, of course the U.S. did this. Of course the U.S. did this. Who else? I said, why doesn't your paper say so? And he said, well, the editor's not so interested in that. And I said, you know, it's really disappointing for me because a long time ago when I was young, you know, your paper ran the Pentagon Papers about the lies in Vietnam. It ran the Watergate exposés. He said, oh, that paper is so dead and gone. You know, we're in a game. Unfortunately, I think a lot of people don't understand it. But if you've been around U.S. foreign policy, as I have for decades, it's transparent. It's not even hard to decipher. That's why it didn't take me long to reach this conclusion. Then came Seymour Hersh with all the details because he has disgruntled people inside the intelligence community who are very unhappy about this, telling him very interesting things. They don't tell me, but they tell him. But it wasn't hard to decipher this. This is not such a complicated case.
It looks pretty clear, but if all the media go the other way, it's still difficult for ordinary people, for people who are not in the know, to believe the opposite point. Although it looks quite logical if you see how countries operate. And you said, and you wrote a piece, and you wrote books on U.S. foreign policy, and you wrote a recent piece this April 13th where you said that you completely agree with Emmanuel Macron, that he spoke the truth when he said that the European Union, though an ally of the U.S., does not want to be a vassal of the U.S. And you said that is the truth. And you also speak of a strategy of U.S. dominance, which includes economic warfare and dependency of allies, so to say, in my own words, that Ambassador Robert Blackwell lined out, and Joe Biden is basically following this playbook word by word. So how is this U.S. strategy of dominance?
Foreign policy is based on the idea of what they technically call full spectrum dominance of the United States in all regions of the world, meaning that our foreign policy doctrine is the United States needs to be the dominant power in Asia, in Europe, in every place in the world, with no challenge, no competitor, no rival. Another term for it is hegemony. This is not a secret. If you live like I do in East Coast universities, at Harvard for tenured professor for more than 20 years on the Harvard faculty, if you taught at Columbia University, if you spent your time in Washington, this is the core idea. It's not a secret. And I presented in this recent op-ed writings of one of the leading U.S. foreign policy experts inside the government, Ambassador Robert Blackwell, who says, yes, it is America's grand strategy to have dominance. Or people could read, Robert Kagan, who is at the Brookings Institution. He's the husband of our Undersecretary of State, yes, Victoria Nuland, and read the book, The Return of the Jungle. The idea is the U.S. is the garden and the rest of the world is the jungle. And the only way that we're going to be safe is if the U.S. hates and holds back the jungle. Well, what the U.S. foreign policy is based on, unlike all other countries almost, which use diplomacy, the U.S. uses regime change as its core instrument. In other words, typically in foreign policy, if you don't aim to be the dominant country of the world, when you're dealing with another country, you you have a foreign policy based on diplomacy. With the United States, if you don't like the other country's government, you try to undermine it and overthrow it and replace it. There are literally dozens of U.S.-led regime change operations. Sometimes they're quite visible. You invade Iraq. Sometimes they're not so clearly understood, as in 2011, when Obama and the U.S. deep state, basically the security institutions, decided to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria. There's a presidential finding ordering the CIA to cooperate with the regional powers to support the overthrow of Assad. That's diplomacy, quote unquote, U.S. style. In 2011, the U.S. led the NATO expedition to overthrow Gaddafi. In other words, don't do diplomacy, overthrow the government. In February 2014, and I think really Europeans should have a look at this, please. In February 2014, the United States actively participated in the overthrow of Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych. I happen to know a lot about that. I happen to have been there soon after the overthrow of Yanukovych.
Probably the stuff you cannot divulge still.
And heard an earful. Europeans, please look at this. The war started in February 2014 with the U.S. role in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Okay, this is something that the U.S. and the European media don't want to say, they don't want to look at. It happens like so many times that inconveniently Russia caught Victoria Nuland on tape on February 6th, 2014. And it's as if that tape doesn't exist. There she is 2 weeks before the government is stormed by a violent storm from the streets saying who the next government is going to be. And she describes who's going to be the next prime minister. This is 2 weeks before the storming of the government buildings. But like so many things, the idea of official secrecy is not to make anyone believe something necessarily, because these stories that the government tells are so unbelievable, but rather to get the media to state a story, believable or not, and to stick with it, and not to look at the facts. This is our problem, really. So if you have a foreign policy that is based on global dominance and on regime change, first of all, you get into a lot of wars. The United States has been in a lot of wars. A lot of wars. These are wars of choice. From Afghanistan, 1979, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Nicaragua, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and now Ukraine. But you need to be able to look at this a little bit, not like the official narrative, but to understand what are the motivations, what are the actual sequences of events that lead to this, what are the deeper causes, in other words, and then it becomes rather decipherable, if I could put it that way. You can understand much better. And if people in Germany or in Europe say, oh, the government doesn't lie, the United States is filled relentlessly with state lying. Read the Pentagon Papers. Look at the Iraq War, 2003. Read Operation Timber Sycamore about the order to overthrow Assad. That's just the tip of the iceberg, but these are good, clear examples. This is what happens with state secrecy and with a foreign policy that's based on regime change. My basic point is it's dangerous, very dangerous. We could have had peace with Russia. Ukraine could have avoided this devastation had the United States not been pushing for hegemonic dominance in the Black Sea region. Why did NATO have to encircle Russia in the Black Sea? And I think it's important in Germany, especially, to remember that Hans Dietrich Genscher was very clear to President Gorbachev in 1990. NATO will not move to the east, not just to
1 inch.
GDR.
Not 1 inch.
Exactly, not 1 inch eastward, but he meant clearly in the east. And that means certainly not Ukraine and Georgia. It's the American idea. Are you kidding? We're going to move NATO to Georgia in the Caucasus? You can't think of anything more reckless. I can't think of anything more reckless. And here we are at war.